Jaxson Hargrove and Kylie Ellison. Two people from two different worlds. He had power, she had nothing. He was feared, she was forgotten. The world looked at him and stepped aside. The world looked at her and looked away. But something happened that no one expected. The man with all the power and all the money pretended to have nothing, gave it all up, every dollar, every connection, every signal of who he really was, because he was looking for something more valuable than anything his empire could offer. And the only person who had it was the last person the world would ever have chosen. This is their story, and it doesn't go the way you think it will. There were exactly 3 people in the world who knew Jaxson Hargrove's real net worth, and 2 of them were dead. The third was his consigliere, a razor-thin man named Pierce Caldwell, who sat across from Jaxson in the back of an armored Escalade, idling outside the Four Seasons in Midtown Manhattan, and said, for what must have been the 100th time that year, "You need a wife." Jaxson didn't look up from his phone. He was reading a message from one of his lieutenants about a shipment reroute through the port of Newark, and the numbers weren't adding up. He deleted the message, pocketed the phone, and said, no. The Underwood are offering their youngest daughter, 24, Princeton educated, speaks 4 languages. I said no. Pierce leaned back against the leather seat and exhaled through his nose, the way he always did when he was calculating how far he could push before Jaxson shut the conversation down permanently. He'd been Jackson's right hand for 11 years, which meant he understood the man better than anyone alive, and he still couldn't crack this particular wall. Because the wall wasn't about strategy. It wasn't about alliances or bloodlines or the quiet arithmetic of organized power. The wall was about Jaxson Hargrove's dead certainty, buried so deep it had calcified into something closer to bone than belief, that no woman on earth would ever love him for anything other than what he could provide. He was 37 years old. He controlled legitimate business holdings worth north of $400 million and illegitimate operations that doubled that number. He owned properties in 6 countries. He had a jaw like a hatchet and shoulders like a refrigerator and eyes the color of gunmetal that made grown men stammer when he looked at them directly. He was, by any external measure, the kind of man who should have had his pick of anyone. And he had. That was the problem. He'd had Nicolette, his college girlfriend, who'd wept and said she loved him right up until the moment she discovered there was a ceiling on his father's generosity, at which point she'd vanished so cleanly you'd think she'd been in witness protection. He'd had Serena, the model, who'd loved him with a devotion that turned out to be perfectly calibrated to the size of the monthly allowance he deposited in her account. He'd had Yara, the attorney, the one he'd actually trusted, the one who'd sat across from him at a candlelit dinner in Positano and told him she saw the man behind the empire. And then he'd found the recording device taped beneath the table and the federal agent she'd been feeding information to for 9 months. Yara had been the last one. 3 years ago. Since then, Jaxson Hargrove had sealed himself inside his empire like a man walling himself into a mausoleum, and he had decided, with the cold certainty that governed every other decision in his life, that love was a transaction and transactions could be gamed. The Underwood won't wait forever, Pierce said. Then they'll stop waiting. The Escalade pulled away from the curb. Rain streaked the windows. Manhattan blurred into gray light and glass, and Jaxson watched it pass without seeing any of it, because something had been growing in him for months, a thought, an idea, a plan so reckless and strange that he hadn't spoken it aloud to anyone, not to Pierce, not to his younger brother Thatcher, who ran the family's real estate front, not to anyone. He was going to find out if it was possible for someone to love him with nothing, not Jaxson Hargrove, the name that made restaurant managers sweat and judges return phone calls. Not the man with the black card and the penthouse and the fleet of vehicles and the army of soldiers who would put a bullet in someone's kneecap if he raised an eyebrow at the wrong angle. Just Jaxson, a man, broke, ordinary, invisible. He was going to strip himself of everything, every dollar, every connection, every signal of power, and walk into the world as no one, and he was going to see what happened, because he had to know. The not knowing was eating him alive. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the only woman who would see anything worth loving in the shell of a man he was about to become was the one the rest of the world had already decided wasn't worth seeing at all. It took him 3 weeks to build the identity. His name would be Jaxson, 35, recently laid off from a warehouse logistics company. No car, no credit. A studio apartment in Kearney, New Jersey, that he'd rented through a shell LLC, and then stripped of anything that cost more than what a man making $14 an hour could afford. He bought clothes from Goodwill, work boots with cracked soles, a Carhartt jacket with a broken zipper, jeans that didn't fit quite right. He grew his beard out. He stopped getting his hair cut. He removed his Patek Philippe and locked it in a safe deposit box, and he bought a Casio digital watch from a gas station for $8. Pierce thought he had lost his mind. "This is insanity," Pierce said, standing in the doorway of the Kearney apartment, looking at the stained linoleum and the mattress on the floor and the kitchen where the faucet dripped a metronome of brown water into the sink. "You're the most powerful man east of Chicago, and you're going to live like this." Voluntarily. For 3 months, Jaxson said. He was sitting on the mattress, lacing up his thrift store boots, and for the first time in years, something in his face looked almost alive. Not happy exactly, more like a man who had been drowning in still water and had finally decided to swim. 3 months, no contact with the organization except emergencies, no money except what I earn. No one knows who I am. And if someone recognizes you? No one sees the help, Pierce. That's the whole point. He wasn't wrong. Within 48 hours, Jaxson Hargrove ceased to exist, and Jaxson, broke, unremarkable, invisible, began his life. He got a job at a grocery store, not a good grocery store, a fluorescent-lit box called Fresh Mart on the outskirts of Kearney, the kind of place where the produce wilted before it hit the shelf, and the manager, a sweating man named Gilroy, called everyone Buddy, in a tone that suggested he'd rather be calling them something worse. Jax's job was stocking shelves on the overnight shift. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., minimum wage plus $1 because nights were hard to fill. He took the bus to get there. He carried his lunch in a brown paper bag, and for the first time in his adult life, Jaxson Hargrove experienced what it felt like to be no one. It started small. The way the bus driver looked through him when he swiped his card. The way customers at Freshmart spoke past him as though he were a fixture, no more human than the shelving unit he was stocking. The way people stepped around him on the sidewalk without adjusting their stride, because adjusting your stride for someone means acknowledging they're there, and Jaxson wasn't the kind of person anyone needed to acknowledge. He'd known poverty existed. He'd grown up watching it from the other side. His father's empire had been built on the backs of desperate people, and Jaxson had inherited that machinery without ever standing inside it. Now he was inside it, and the machinery looked different from here. It looked like fluorescent lights that gave you headaches after 8 hours. It looked like a paycheck that didn't cover rent and groceries in the same month. It looked like exhaustion that lived in your bones, not because the work was hard, but because the work was endless and meaningless, and no one cared whether you did it well. He'd been living the identity for 2 weeks when he decided to test the other half of his experiment. He tried dating. He created a profile on a free dating app. No premium features because Jaxson couldn't afford them. He used a photo of himself in the Goodwill clothes, unshaved, standing in front of the Kearney apartment building. He listed his job as retail associate and his interests as cooking and reading, which were the only things he could list without lying beyond the lie he was already living. The results were immediate and devastating. A woman named Chelsea matched with him, chatted brightly for 20 minutes about music and travel, and then asked what he did for a living. When he told her he stocked shelves at a grocery store, the typing indicator appeared and disappeared 3 times before she sent a single word. "Oh." She unmatched 12 minutes later. A woman named Priya agreed to meet him for coffee. She was warm and smart and laughed at his jokes, and then she watched him pay for his $3 coffee by counting exact change from his pocket. And something in her eyes shifted, not cruelty exactly, but recalibration, the way you'd adjust a thermostat. And she said she had to leave early for a thing she'd forgotten about, and she never responded to his follow-up text. A woman named Brecken was the most honest. She sat across from him at a diner booth, looked at his cracked boots and his Casio watch, and his face that hadn't seen a proper barber in 3 weeks, and said, "Look, you seem like a nice guy, but I'm at a point in my life where I need someone with a little more stability. You know, like a plan." He did know. He was starting to understand, with a clarity that felt like a blade, exactly how much of what he'd experienced as connection in his previous life had been proximity to his wallet. It was on a Thursday evening in his 4th week. Damp October, the kind of night that smelled like wet concrete and dying leaves, that he first saw Kylie Ellison. He was sitting on a bench outside a laundromat on Bergen Avenue, waiting for his clothes to dry because the dryer in his apartment building was broken and had been broken since before he'd moved in. He was eating a gas station sandwich and watching the street do nothing in particular. And he saw a woman come out of the community center, across the road, carrying 2 cardboard boxes stacked so high she couldn't see over them. She was heavy. That was the first thing he noticed, and he noticed it the way the world had trained him to notice it, as a category, a shorthand, a filter that sorted people into boxes marked visible and invisible. Before they'd even spoken, she was carrying the boxes awkwardly, her arms stretched wide around them, her steps careful on the cracked sidewalk, and she was wearing a blue cardigan that was pilling at the elbows and sneakers that had seen better years. She stumbled. Not badly. One foot caught the edge of an uneven slab, and she wobbled, the boxes tipping, and she caught herself with that particular grace that heavy people develop, the constant negotiation with a world built for smaller bodies, the knowledge that every stumble is public and every recovery is watched. A man walking past, leather jacket, earbuds in, moving fast, sidestepped her without slowing. A couple on the other side of the street didn't even glance over. Jaxson watched her right herself, shift the boxes and keep walking, and something in the way she did it, the quiet determination, the absence of expectation that anyone would help, made him stand up. "Hey," he said, jogging across the street. "Can I grab one of those?" She peered around the boxes at him. She had brown eyes, not the kind of brown that poets write about, not amber or mahogany or any of those words that exist, because men decided some browns were beautiful and some were just brown. Her eyes were dark and warm and wary, the eyes of someone who had learned that unsolicited help usually came with a price tag. "I've got it," she said. "I can see that, but your arms are going to fall off in about 30 seconds. A pause. She studied. Him, the beard, the cracked boots, the jacket with the broken zipper, and something in her assessment was different from the assessment he'd gotten from Chelsea and Priya and Brecken. Those women had looked at him and seen what he lacked. This woman looked at him and seemed to be deciding something else entirely, whether he was safe. "The top one," she said. "It's lighter." He took the top box. It was full of children's books, dog-eared and soft-spined. He walked beside her to a white Toyota with a dent in the rear quarter panel, and she opened the trunk with her hip because her hands were full, and they loaded the boxes in together. "Thank you," she said. She pushed a strand of dark hair behind her ear. She was sweating slightly from the effort, and she didn't try to hide it, which struck him as unusually honest. "What's all the books for?" "I run a reading program at the community center. For kids who—" She stopped herself as though deciding how much to explain to a stranger. "For kids who need it. That's good work. It doesn't pay." She said it without bitterness, just flatly, the way you'd state the weather. "I'm Jax," he said. "Kylie." She got in her car. She didn't ask for his number. She didn't linger. She pulled away from the curb, and the taillights of her dented Toyota disappeared down Bergen Avenue. And Jax Morrow stood on the sidewalk in the October cold and realized that was the first conversation he'd had in 4 weeks where the other person hadn't been performing. She hadn't flirted. She hadn't tried to impress him. She hadn't calculated his worth or angled for information. She had simply been a person talking to another person, and the interaction had lasted maybe 90 seconds, and it was the most real thing that had happened to him in years. He didn't seek her out. That wasn't how the test was supposed to work. He wasn't supposed to choose someone. He was supposed to let someone choose him. But Kearney was a small place, and the community center was 2 blocks from the laundromat and 3 blocks from the bus stop he used every night to get to Freshmart. And so he saw her again. And again. And again. He saw her unlocking the community center at 7 in the morning with a coffee in one hand and her keys in her teeth. He saw her chasing a 6-year-old down the sidewalk while the kid shrieked with laughter and Kylie shouted, "Deshaun, I swear if you run into that street." He saw her sitting on the center's front steps one evening, eating a sandwich alone, reading a paperback with the spine cracked so far it was nearly in 2 pieces. He saw the way other people treated her at the Freshmart, where she came in on Wednesday evenings to buy groceries. He watched from behind the cereal aisle as 2 women in yoga pants whispered to each other while Kylie reached for a box of pasta, and one of them, ponytail, manicured nails, the kind of casual cruelty that comes with never having been on the receiving end, said just loud enough, "Some people really should try the salad section first." Kylie's hand froze on the pasta box for half a second, just half a second. Then she put it in her cart and moved on. He saw her at the bus stop one morning, standing in the rain because the shelter's bench had been taken by 3 teenagers who sprawled across it as though it belonged to them, and none of them shifted an inch to make room. A man waiting for the same bus looked at Kylie, looked at the rain soaking through her cardigan, and then took a deliberate step to the side, not to make room, but to distance himself, as though standing near her might be read as association. Jaxson watched all of this from the margins of his false life, and something inside him began to shift in a direction he hadn't anticipated. He'd started this experiment to find out if anyone could love him without his money. He hadn't expected to spend most of it watching someone else navigate a different kind of invisibility, one that had nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with the size of her body and the smallness of other people's imaginations. Their second real conversation happened because of rain. He was leaving Freshmart at 6 in the morning after his shift, bone-tired and smelling like cardboard and floor cleaner, and the sky opened up, not drizzle, a full assault, sheets of water that turned the parking lot into a shallow lake in under a minute. He stood under the store's awning, debating whether to walk to the bus stop and accept the drowning, and that's when he saw the white Toyota with a dented quarter panel sitting in the parking lot, with its hood up and steam rising from the engine. Kylie was sitting in the driver's seat, with the door open, staring at the engine like it had personally offended her. She was already wet. Her cardigan, a different one, green this time, but still pilling, was dark with rain across the shoulders. "That doesn't look great," he said, walking over. She looked up. Recognition flickered across her face. "Box guy. Jax. I remember." She gestured at the engine. "My radiator hose cracked. Apparently this is what happens when you drive a car held together by prayer and duct tape. You need a tow. I need a time machine to go back to 2019 when this car was merely unreliable instead of actively hostile." She pulled out her phone, looked at it, and put it back in her pocket. "I called a tow. They said 45 minutes. That was an hour ago." He sat down on the wet curb next to her car. She looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize, not suspicion exactly, but a kind of careful attention, as though she was waiting for the catch. "You don't have to wait with me," she said. "I know. Seriously, you just got off a shift, right? You look exhausted." "I am exhausted, but I'm also already wet, and the bus doesn't come for 20 minutes, so." He shrugged. "Tell me about the, reading program." She studied him for another long moment. Then she sat down on the curb beside him, and she told him. It was called Read Bridge. She'd started it 4 years ago after quitting a soul-deadening desk job at an insurance company. The community center let her use the space for free in exchange for running their after-school activities, which meant she was technically working 2 jobs for the pay of 0. She had 23 kids in the program, ages 6 to 12, most from families where books were a luxury and reading for pleasure was an abstraction. She drove to library sales and thrift stores across 3 counties to find books. She wrote grants on weekends, She'd been turned down for funding 14 times. 14? He said. 15, actually. I forgot about the Holcomb Foundation. They sent me a letter that was so politely devastating I framed it. She almost smiled. They said my program showed admirable community spirit, but didn't align with their strategic funding priorities, which I think means they gave the money to someone with a better logo. That's criminal. That's non-profits. The tow truck arrived. The driver was 40 minutes late and annoyed about it, and he looked at Kylie in her steaming car and said, "This thing's barely worth towing." And Jaxson felt something hot and sharp rise in his chest, the reflex of a man accustomed to making people regret their disrespect, and he swallowed it. Jax Morrow didn't have that power. Jax Morrow could only stand on a wet curb and watch. But Kylie handled it herself. She looked at the driver with a steadiness that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with exhaustion that had crystallized into patience, and she said, "It's worth towing to me. Can you take it to Ruiz Auto on Skylar, please?" The driver shrugged and loaded it up. When the truck pulled away, Kylie turned to Jax and said, "Thanks for sitting with me. That was..." She stopped. People don't usually do that. Sit on wet curbs? Stay. The word landed between them with a weight that had nothing to do with radiator hoses. He held her gaze for a moment too long, and she looked away first, pulling her wet cardigan tighter around herself, and he understood that she had just told him something enormous without meaning to. People don't stay. That was her experience. People leave, or they never arrive in the first place. "Oh, I'll see you around, Kylie." "See you around, Jax." After that, the seeing around became deliberate on both sides, though neither of them admitted it. He started stopping by the community center on his way to the bus stop. She was always there, painting a mural with kids, or reorganizing bookshelves, or arguing on the phone with someone about a water heater that had been broken for 3 months. He'd lean against the doorframe and wait for her to notice him, and when she did, her face would do something complicated. Pleasure and wariness and a kind of preemptive bracing, as though every good thing came with an expiration date she was already counting down to. He brought her coffee once. Gas station coffee, because that was what Jax Morrow could afford. She took it like he'd handed her a diamond. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "It's 79 cents. It's not about the price." She was right. It wasn't. They fell into a rhythm. He'd help her carry boxes. She'd save him a seat on the community center steps. They'd talk, real talk, the kind that meanders through childhood memories and half-formed opinions, and the quiet confessions that only happen when two people are sitting close together in the dark, and neither one is performing. She told him about growing up in Bayonne with a mother who was constantly dieting, and a father who left when Kylie was 11, and a sister who was thin and blonde and beloved in the way that thin, blonde girls are beloved in a world that treats beauty like currency. She told him about the first time she was called fat. She was 8. It was a boy named Kevin Briggs, and she could still remember the exact shade of red his backpack was. She told him about the years of trying to shrink herself, the diets, the gym memberships, the morning runs that left her crying on the sidewalk, not from exertion, but from the feeling that no matter how far she ran, she was always running toward a version of herself that didn't exist. "I stopped," she said one evening. They were sitting on the steps, the October air sharp and clean, and the streetlights were just coming on. "About 3 years ago, I just stopped, not stopped caring about my health, but stopped trying to earn my way into being treated like a person. I decided I was going to be a person regardless. How's that working out? Some days it's revolutionary. Some days it's just exhausting." She asked him about himself, and this was where the guilt started. He told her truths, wrapped in lies. He told her he'd grown up on the East Coast. True. That his father had been a hard man. True. That he'd spent most of his adult life in a world he didn't choose. True. That he was trying to figure out who he was outside of that world. True in a way that would have astonished her if she'd known the full shape of it. He told her he was broke, and she didn't flinch. She didn't recalculate. She didn't develop a sudden prior engagement. She just nodded and said, "Me too. Welcome to the club. Meetings are Tuesdays. The only refreshment is anxiety. He laughed. He hadn't laughed, really laughed, the kind that starts in your stomach and catches you off guard, in longer than he could remember. He was falling for her. He knew it the way you know a storm is coming, the pressure change, the shift in the air, the knowledge that something irreversible is about to happen, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. She was falling for him too, though she would have denied it if asked. She would have said she didn't have time. She would have said she'd learned not to invest in things that weren't built to last. She would have said all the reasonable, self-protective things that people say when they're trying to talk themselves out of feeling something that terrifies them, but her face gave her away every time he appeared in the doorway. And the way she found excuses to touch his arm when she talked, and the way she said his name, Jax, with a softness that she reserved for no other word. 6 weeks in, on a night when the temperature had dropped enough to turn their breath visible, they were walking back from a corner store where Kylie had bought supplies for a Reed Bridge holiday event, and she slipped on a patch of ice. He caught her, his hands closed around her arms, and she collided with his chest, and for a moment they were pressed together, her face inches from his, her breath warm on his jaw, her eyes wide with surprise and something else. And the world contracted to the space between their bodies. "Sorry," she whispered. She didn't pull away. "Don't be. She laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, the kind that covers what you're actually filing. "I'm not exactly light. You probably should have let me fall." "That's never going to happen." He said it quietly, and he meant it in so many more ways than she knew, and the guilt hit him like a fist because he was lying to this woman. Every day, every conversation, every moment of closeness was built on a deception, and she was giving him something real. Her trust, her humor, her wounded and cautious and beautiful honesty, and he was giving her a fiction. He let go of her arms. She stepped back. The moment evaporated into the cold night air. "I should get home," she said. "Kylie. I'll see you tomorrow, Jax." She walked away, and he stood on the frozen sidewalk and hated himself with a precision and thoroughness that would have impressed anyone who'd ever tried to hate Jaxson Hargrove. The problem with living a lie is that the world doesn't pause to accommodate your moral crisis. While Jaxson was falling in love with Kylie Ellison on the frozen sidewalks of Kearney, New Jersey, the machinery of his real life was grinding forward without him. Pierce called on a burner phone every Sunday. The updates were compressed and urgent. The Underwood were making moves on Jackson's distribution network. A federal investigation had subpoenaed records from one of his shell companies. His brother Thatcher had made a deal without authorization that was going to require delicate correction. "You need to come back," Pierce said during the 8th Sunday call. "Not yet." "Jaxson," I said not yet. He couldn't come back yet. He couldn't come back because he hadn't finished what he'd started, and because leaving now meant leaving Kylie, and leaving Kylie had become unthinkable in a way that frightened him. But the outside world was pressing in from another direction too, one he hadn't anticipated. There was a man named Boyd Wessler. He was the property manager for the building that housed the community center. A paunchy man with a comb-over and a gold watch he couldn't afford, and the particular brand of petty authority that flourishes in men who have been given a small amount of power over people with no recourse. Boyd had been raising the rent on the community center space for 2 years, incrementally, strategically, squeezing Kylie's program the way you'd squeeze a tube of toothpaste. Slowly enough that no single increase was worth fighting over, but relentlessly enough that the end was inevitable. Jaxson learned about Boyd because Kylie told him one evening on the steps, in a voice that was trying very hard to be matter-of-fact and failing. "He wants to raise it another $300 a month. She did the math in her head, the way people do when every number is a wound. "That's more than I bring in from donations in a good month. I can't cover it." "Can you negotiate?" "I've tried." He doesn't negotiate. He just tells me I'm welcome to find another space and then looks at me like he's doing me a favor by not kicking me out today. She picked at the hem of her cardigan. She stopped. "He also what?" She was quiet for a long time. Then, "He makes comments about my weight. Not outright, just, jokes, Little remarks about how the floor joists can only take so much, haha, or asking if the snack table at the kids' events is really for the kids, that kind of thing. The heat in Jackson's chest flared so violently, he had to press his hands flat on the concrete step to keep himself seated. In his other life, Boyd Wessler would be having a very different kind of conversation. The kind that took place in a room with no windows and ended with a revised understanding of how one speaks to other human beings. But Jax Morrow had no leverage. Jax Morrow was a grocery store clerk who couldn't even fix his own apartment's dryer. "He shouldn't talk to you like that," Jaxson said. His voice was controlled, but Kylie glanced at him and something flickered across her face. She'd heard the undertone, the steel beneath the calm, and it surprised her. "People talk to me like that all the time, Jax." "That doesn't make it right." "No, but it makes it Tuesday." The way she said it, dry, resigned, without self-pity, broke something in him, not because she was weak, because she was so profoundly strong, and the world was punishing her for it. He started paying closer attention after that, and what he saw made the heat in his chest burn hotter. He saw the way the cashier at the pharmacy spoke to Kylie in a loud, slow voice, as though her body size had somehow impacted her hearing. He saw the way the bus seat beside her was always the last one taken. He saw the way men looked at her, not with hostility, which would at least have been a form of acknowledgement, but with nothing. As though she were a blank wall, a parked car, a thing to walk past. He saw the way her Reed Bridge kids looked at her too, and that was different. Those kids looked at her like she'd hung the moon. A girl named Aaliyah, 7 years old, with braids and a gap-toothed grin, hugged Kylie every single day with the kind of full-body commitment that only children are capable of, and Kylie would scoop her up and say, "Hey, my favorite reader," and Aaliyah would say, "I finished a whole chapter by myself," and Kylie would react as though Aaliyah had just announced she'd been accepted to Harvard. Those kids saw Kylie. They saw her clearly and completely, with the uncorrupted vision of people who hadn't yet learned that the world sorts human beings by the shape of their bodies. Jaxson saw her too, and what he saw was the most remarkable person he had ever met. Not because she was kind, though she was, not because she was brave, though she was that too, but because she had built a life of meaning in a world that had told her every day in 1,000 small and large ways that she didn't matter, and she had refused to believe it. She had taken the hand she was dealt and played it with a grace that put every power broker and kingpin Jaxson had ever known to absolute shame. He wanted to tell her the truth. The urge was a physical thing, a pressure behind his sternum that built every time she looked at him with those brown eyes that held more honesty than he deserved. But the truth would end it. He knew that with the same certainty he knew anything. The truth would transform him from Jax, the broke grocery store worker who sat on wet curbs and brought gas station coffee, from a person into a symbol, a mogul, a category. And she would look at him and see the category, and the man she'd been building something with would disappear, replaced by a headline. So he kept lying. And the lie got heavier every day. The crisis came on a Friday evening in late November. The community center was hosting its annual Reed Bridge celebration, a small event, potluck style, where the kids read excerpts from their favorite books, and Kylie gave out hand-decorated certificates, and parents who worked 3 jobs somehow found time to show up and clap for their children. It was the kind of event that doesn't make the news and keeps the world turning. Jaxson was there. He'd been helping Kylie set up since 3 o'clock, hanging paper streamers and arranging folding chairs and testing the ancient sound system that required a specific sequence of button presses and percussive maintenance to function. He was wearing his cleanest Goodwill flannel, and he'd trimmed his beard, and Kylie had looked at him when he walked in and smiled in a way that made his chest ache. But the kids were reading. Aaliyah was in the middle of a passage from a book about a girl who talks to dolphins, reading slowly and carefully and with enormous concentration when Boyd Wessler walked in. He wasn't alone. He had 2 men with him, suits, clipboards, the universally recognizable energy of people who are about to deliver bad news and feel important about it. Boyd surveyed the room with the satisfied expression of a man who has been building towards something unpleasant and has finally arrived. "Ms. Ellison," he said loud enough to cut through Aaliyah's reading. The girl trailed off, looking up with wide eyes. "We need to talk." Kylie moved toward him, keeping her voice low. "Boyd, we're in the middle of an event. Can this wait?" "Wait, it can't, actually." He held up a folder. "Your lease expires at the end of the month. I'm not renewing it." The room went quiet, not the quiet of attention, but the quiet of oxygen being sucked out of a space. Parents looked at each other. Kids looked at their parents. Aaliyah was still standing at the makeshift podium, her book open in her hands, her lower lip starting to tremble. "You told me I had until January," Kylie said. Her voice was steady, but Jaxson could see her hands shaking at her sides. "Plans change. The space has been leased to a new tenant, effective December 1st. Boyd smiled. It was the smile of a man who knows he holds all the cards and wants you to know it too. "Oh, you'll need to have everything out by the 30th. "Boyd, these kids, this program is not my concern, Ms. Ellison. Business is business." One of the parents, a woman in scrubs who'd clearly come straight from a shift, stood up. "She's been here for 4 years. You can't just—" "I can, actually. It's my building." Boyd looked around the room with the expression of someone surveying an inconvenience. His gaze landed on the potluck table, then on Kylie, and the corner of his mouth twitched. Maybe if the budget had been spent on rent instead of refreshments. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The implication hung in the air like smoke, and Jaxson saw Kylie's face change, saw the armor she'd spent years building crack just for a moment, just enough for the hurt to show through. And something inside him detonated, not the contained, strategic anger of Jaxson Hargrove, who dismantled enemies with phone calls and legal maneuvers and the occasional, calculated demonstration of consequences. This was something raw. This was the anger of a man watching the woman he loved be humiliated in front of the children she had given everything to protect by a small, cruel man who thought the world owed him deference because his name was on a lease. He stepped forward. "Get out." Boyd looked at him for the first time, looked at the cracked boots and the Goodwill flannel and the trimmed beard that still couldn't quite disguise the face of a man who had made other men beg. "Excuse me?" I said, "Get out. You've delivered your message. Now leave." "And who exactly are you?" Jaxson looked at him, just looked, and whatever Boyd Wessler saw in those gunmetal eyes, whatever evolutionary signal fired in the reptilian base of his brain that told him this was not a grocery store clerk. This was not a man you could dismiss, made him take a half step backward. "I'm someone who's asking you to leave," Jaxson said quietly. "Right now, before this conversation goes somewhere neither of us wants it to go." Boyd left. His two suits followed. The door closed behind them, and the room exhaled. But the damage was done. Kylie stood in the middle of the community center with her paper streamers and her folding chairs and her hand-decorated certificates, and she looked like someone who had just watched a building collapse with everything she owned inside it. Aaliyah walked up to her and pulled on her sleeve. "Miss Kylie, do I still get to read my book?" Kylie looked down at the girl, and she did something that made Jackson's throat close. She smiled, not a real smile, a constructed one, built from sheer willpower and the refusal to let a 7-year-old see her fall apart. "Of course you do, baby. Go ahead." Aaliyah went back to the podium and kept reading about the girl who talks to dolphins, and Kylie stood with her arms crossed and her shoulders square and her eyes bright with tears she would not let fall. And Jaxson understood with a certainty that felt like a wound, that he was in love with this woman and that he had been lying to her every day, and that both of those things could not continue to be true at the same time. After the event, after the parents took their kids home and the folding chairs were stacked and the streamers were pulled down, Kylie sat on the steps of the community center and cried. She didn't cry the way she did anything else in public, carefully, minimally, with an awareness of being watched. She cried like someone who had been holding a dam in place with her bare hands for years and had finally let go. Jaxson sat beside her and said nothing. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't offer platitudes. He just sat there, close, enough that his shoulder touched hers, and let her feel whatever she was feeling without commentary. When the crying slowed, she said, "I don't know what I'm going to do." "You're going to figure it out." "I don't have anywhere to take them, Jax. I've been looking for months. Every space I can afford is a closet or a condemned building, or 3 bus transfers from where the kids live, and the ones that are right are," she laughed, wet and bitter, "are priced for people who aren't me." "What if I could help?" She looked at him. "You stock shelves at a grocery store." "I know, but Jax." She put her hand on his arm. "You're the kindest person I've met in a long time, but kindness doesn't pay rent. Trust me. I've tested that theory extensively." He wanted to tell her. The words were right there, stacked behind his teeth, like ammunition. "I'm not who you think I am. I have $400 million. I could buy that building, and every building on this block, and make Boyd Wessler spend the rest of his life regretting the day he learned your name." But he couldn't, because the moment he said those words, everything they'd built, every honest conversation, every wet curb, every gas station coffee, would be retroactively contaminated. She would look back at every moment and wonder what was real. She would wonder if he'd been studying her, testing her, manipulating her. She would wonder if his presence in her life had been an experiment. And the answer, horribly, was yes. It had started as an experiment. It had stopped being one the day she said, "People don't usually stay," on a rainy curb outside Freshmart, and something inside him recognized something inside her. "I'll help you find a space," he said. "We'll figure it out." "Jax, Kylie, I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long time. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the steps of a community center that was about to be taken from her, and neither of them said anything. And it was the most honest moment of Jaxson Hargrove's deeply dishonest life. The next 2 weeks were a frantic scramble. Kylie called every church, every community organization, every sympathetic business owner in a 10-mile radius, looking for a space she could afford. Jax helped. He made calls on his lunch breaks, visited spaces on his days off, drafted letters to potential donors in handwriting that was considerably more polished than a grocery store clerk's should have been, though Kylie didn't comment on it. They found nothing. Every option was too expensive, too far, or too broken. The clock ticked toward December 1st, and Kylie's composure began to fray at the edges. And then, because the universe has a sense of timing that borders on cruelty, the other shoe dropped. It was a Tuesday evening. Kylie was at the community center, packing boxes, slowly, reluctantly, each book she wrapped in newspaper, a small concession to defeat, when Boyd Wessler returned. This time he wasn't there about the lease. This time he was there about something else entirely. Jaxson wasn't there when it happened. He heard about it afterward from Kylie, who told him in a voice so flat and controlled that it terrified him more than tears would have. Boyd had come in alone. He'd watched her pack for a moment. Then he'd closed the door behind him, and he'd said, "You know, Kylie, this doesn't have to be so hard." She kept packing. "What do you mean?" "I mean there are arrangements, ways to make things work for people who are willing to be flexible." She'd looked up, and she'd understood, not from his words, but from the way he was standing, too close, hip against a table, arms crossed with a deliberate casualness that was the opposite of casual, and from the way his eyes moved over her body, not with attraction, but with the possessive assessment of a man who believes that a woman with no options is a woman who belongs to him. "Get out," she'd said. "Think about it. You need a space. I have a space. We could help each other." Get out. He'd left. And Kylie had sat down on the floor of the community center, surrounded by half-packed boxes of children's books, and she'd felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not sadness, not anger, but a deep, marrow-level exhaustion with the project of being a woman in a world where men like Boyd Wessler existed and thrived and faced no consequences. She told Jaxson the next day. She told him on the steps, in the cold, in the voice that was trying to be a report and kept threatening to become something else. When she finished, the silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the traffic signal clicking on the corner a block away. "Jax," she said. "Say something." He was gripping the edge of the concrete steps so hard that his knuckles had gone white. His jaw was clenched, his eyes, which she had always found warm in a way that surprised her. Warm wasn't a word she'd have expected to apply to those steel-gray irises, were not warm now. They were something else. Something that looked like the blade of a knife catching light. "I'm going to handle this," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm going to handle it." "Jax, you can't. You're a—" She stopped. She'd been about to say, "You're a stock boy," and the words felt wrong, not because of what they implied about his limitations, but because something in his voice, in his entire bearing, had shifted in a way that didn't match the man she thought she knew. "What are you going to do?" "I need to make some calls." "Calls to who?" "Jax, talk to me." But he was already standing up, and the look on his face was one she'd never seen before, not on Jax Morrow's face anyway. It was the look of a man who has been restraining himself for a very long time and has just decided to stop. He called Pierce from a payphone 3 blocks away. "I need a full workup on a man named Boyd Wessler," he said. "Property manager, operates in Kearney. I want everything. Financial records, tax filings, building code violations, tenant complaints, everything." "Does this mean you're—" "It means I'm handling something. How fast can you get it?" 24 hours. "You have 12. Pierce delivered in 10. The file was waiting in a dead drop at a storage unit in Newark, a manila envelope thick enough to be a novel, containing the complete financial biography of Boyd Wessler. It was worse than Jaxson had expected. Boyd wasn't just a petty tyrant, he was a fraudulent one. He'd been inflating maintenance costs across his properties for years, pocketing the difference. He'd failed to address building code violations in 3 of his buildings, including one that had a structural issue in the stairwell that could, according to an engineer's report that had been conveniently buried, collapse under stress. He was behind on property taxes. He'd been the subject of 2 harassment complaints from former tenants, both quietly settled with non-disclosure agreements. Boyd Wessler was a house of cards in a cheap suit, and Jaxson Hargrove held every breeze. The question was how to use it. The old Jaxson would have made 1 phone call. Boyd would have been visited. There would have been a conversation. The kind of conversation that leaves no marks and creates lasting impressions, and the problem would have been resolved within the hour. But Jaxson was acutely aware that he was standing at a crossroads that had nothing to do with Boyd Wessler and everything to do with who he wanted to be. He could destroy Boyd from the shadows. He had the power and the infrastructure, but doing it that way meant doing it as Jaxson Hargrove, the man who solved problems through fear and force, and that man was exactly who he'd been trying to escape. Or he could do it the right way, the legal way, the way that would take longer and require more exposure and might, probably would blow his cover entirely, but would leave him standing on ground that Kylie could respect. He chose the second path, and it cost him everything. He contacted a reporter, not through Pierce, not through channels, but directly. A woman named Ingrid Backer at the Bergen Record who'd spent her career covering local corruption, and who, when Jaxson called her from the payphone and described what he had, said, "If even half of this checks out, this man is finished." He gave her the documents, all of them. He gave them anonymously, refusing to identify himself, and Ingrid was experienced enough to accept the arrangement without pressing. Then, he called a lawyer, a real one, a legal aid attorney named Clementine Vasquez, who worked tenant rights cases pro bono, and who, when she reviewed the building code violations and the harassment complaints, said, "This is actionable. This is very, very actionable." He put Clementine in touch with the 2 women who had signed NDAs, and Clementine said the NDAs were unenforceable because they'd been signed under duress, and the women agreed to talk, and Jaxson felt something he hadn't felt since the beginning of this entire experiment. Useful. Not powerful, useful. Oh, there was a difference, and it was enormous. The Bergen Record ran the story on a Monday. It was detailed, damning, and thorough. Oh, Boyd Wessler's financial fraud, his building code negligence, the harassment allegations, All of it laid out with the kind of meticulous documentation that leaves no room for denial. By Wednesday, the county had opened an investigation. By Friday, Boyd's properties were being inspected. By the following Monday, his business license was suspended pending review. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, because Jaxson had been too focused on dismantling Boyd to manage his own cover story, the truth began to unravel. It started with Ingrid Bakker. She was a good reporter, good enough to wonder where a stack of forensic quality financial documents had come from, and good enough to trace the storage unit where the dead drop had been made, and good enough to find a security camera that showed a man in a Goodwill flannel and cracked boots who didn't move like a man in a Goodwill flannel and cracked boots. She didn't publish it. She did something worse. She called Kylie. Kylie told him about the call on a Thursday evening, sitting on the steps of the community center that she was now, thanks to the investigation, not required to vacate. Her voice was different, not flat, not controlled, not doing any of the things she did to protect herself. Her voice was raw. "A reporter called me," she said. "Ingrid Bakker, from the Bergen Record." Jaxson went very still. "She asked me about you, about Jax Morrow." Kylie looked at him, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who is holding the last piece of a puzzle they don't want to complete. "She said the documents that took down Boyd came from someone matching your description. She said she tried to look into Jax Morrow and couldn't find him. No social security trail. No employment history before 2 months ago. No past." She paused. "She asked me if I knew who you really were." The silence between them was the loudest thing Jaxson had ever heard. "Do you?" she asked. He could have lied, one more lie on top of all the others. He could have deflected, explained, constructed some plausible story that would buy him time. Instead, he told her the truth, not gently, not strategically. He told her the way a man tells the truth when he's been carrying it so long that his arms are shaking, clumsily, desperately, with the kind of completeness that leaves nothing hidden. He told her his name was Jaxson Hargrove. He told her about the empire, the money, the power. He told her about Nicolette and Serena and Yara. He told her about the experiment, the test, the idea that he could strip himself of everything and find out if anyone could love what was left. He told her about the dating app and Chelsea and Priya and Brecken. He told her about sitting on a bench outside a laundromat and watching a woman carry 2 boxes of children's books and stumble on a cracked sidewalk and keep going. He told her he loved her. He said it simply, without decoration. The way you say something that has become so fundamental to your daily existence, that embellishing it would be like describing the taste of water. "I love you, Kylie. And I know that doesn't mean what it should mean right now, because everything I built between us was built on a lie, and you have every right to..." "Stop," she said. He stopped. She stood up. She crossed her arms. She looked down at him sitting on the steps, and her face was doing something he'd never seen before, a kind of terrible arithmetic, as though she were retroactively recalculating every conversation, every moment, every gas station coffee and wet curb and shoulder leaned upon, adjusting each memory for the variable she hadn't known was present. "You tested me," she said. "That's not... You created a fake identity so you could test women, like a science experiment, like..." Her voice cracked. "Like we were subjects. Kylie. And I passed. Congratulations. The fat girl who can't get a date was nice to the fake poor guy. What a heartwarming result." The bitterness in her voice was so concentrated, it was almost chemical. "Is that the story? Is that the narrative? Because let me tell you how it sounds from here, Jaxson, whoever you are. It sounds like a man with too much money and too many options decided to go slumming, and he found a woman desperate enough to be grateful for gas station coffee, and now he wants credit for noticing she had a personality. That is not what this is. Then what is it? Because from where I'm standing, you lied to me. Every day, every conversation, you looked me in the face and you lied, and she pressed her hand against her mouth for a moment. When she took it away, her chin was trembling. I told you things. Real things. Things I don't tell people. About my family. About being called fat. About, she stopped. About people not staying. I'm not. And the whole time, you were someone else. You were a man with $400 million, playing pretend. Do you understand how that feels? Do you understand what it's like to find out that the one person who made you feel seen was wearing a costume? She was crying now, and it wasn't the damn breaking cry from the night of the Reed Bridge event. It was a quieter, more devastating kind of crying, the slow leak of someone who has been punctured in a place they thought was protected. I need you to leave, she said. Kylie, please. I need you to leave right now. He left. He walked back to the apartment in Kearney that he didn't need, wearing clothes he hadn't had to buy, and he sat on the mattress on the floor and stared at the wall and understood, for the first time in his life, that having all the power in the world meant nothing, when the only person who mattered wanted nothing to do with you. He didn't call her. He wanted to. The impulse was almost physical, a magnetic pull that made him reach for his phone 15 times in the first hour. But he didn't, because Kylie had asked him to leave, and respecting that request was the first honest thing he could give her. Instead, he did something he hadn't done in the entire 10 weeks of the experiment. He went home, not to the Kearney apartment, to the real home, the penthouse on the Upper West Side, 63 floors above the city, where the closets were full of hand-tailored suits, and the kitchen had appliances that cost more than most people's cars, and the view of Central Park was so vast and beautiful, it felt like a form of aggression. He stood in the foyer and felt nothing, less than nothing. The marble floors and the recessed lighting and the art on the walls. All of it looked like a movie set, hollow and unconvincing, a display that had been assembled to communicate wealth to people who could be impressed by such things. Kylie would not have been impressed. She would have looked at this place and seen what it was, a very expensive way to be alone. Pierce was waiting. His consigliere had the good sense not to comment on Jackson's appearance. The beard, the Goodwill clothes, the expression of a man who has recently lost something he didn't know could be lost. The Moretti situation needs attention, Pierce said, and the federal subpoena. I need you to do something for me first. Name it. The community center in Kearney. The one on Bergen Avenue. I want the building purchased, quietly, through a non-profit shell, not connected to me or any of our holdings. The purchase price should be fair market value. I don't want to lowball it and create questions. And the current property manager, Boyd Wessler, is going to have his hands full with the county investigation. Let the legal process handle him. I also want a trust established to fund the Reed Bridge program. Perpetual, enough to cover rent, supplies, salaries for 2 additional staff, and a transportation fund for the kids who live outside walking distance. The trust should be managed independently. Kylie Ellison should have no idea where the funding comes from. Pierce wrote it all down without expression. Then he looked up and said, You found someone. I found someone who found me, and who now never wants to see me again. So this is, what, a parting gift? Jaxson looked out the window at the city, at the bridges and the lights, and the incomprehensible enormity of a place where 8 million people lived within arm's reach of each other, and most of them were alone. It's not for me, he said. It's for 23 kids who need a place to read. The trust was established within a week. The building purchase took longer, 3 weeks of legal filings and inspections. But by mid-December, the community center was owned by a nonprofit called Cornerstone Community Holdings, and Kylie received a letter informing her that her rent had been reduced to $1 per year and that a grant had been approved to fund Reed Bridge operations for the next 5 years. She called the number on the letter. It went to a law firm in Manhattan. She asked where the funding came from. They told her the donor wished to remain anonymous. She asked again, more forcefully, and they repeated the answer, and she hung up and sat in the community center surrounded by books and kids and a future she hadn't dared to imagine. And she knew exactly where it came from. He didn't call her. He didn't send her messages. He didn't engineer accidental encounters. He went back to his life, the suits, the meetings, the carefully managed violence of his empire, and he carried Kylie Ellison with him like a stone in his pocket, a constant weight that reminded him of everything he was and everything he was not. But he did one more thing. He went back to Boyd Wessler. Not as Jax Morrow and not through intermediaries. He went as Jaxson Hargrove in a three-piece suit, in the back of the armored Escalade, and he had Pierce arrange a meeting at a diner on Route 17 that Boyd was too confused and too frightened to decline. Boyd sat across from him and recognized nothing. He didn't see Jax Morrow. He saw a man in a suit that cost more than Boyd's car, with eyes that were doing something to the air temperature in the booth. "Do you know who I am?" Jaxson asked. "No. Should I?" "Probably not, but you should know that I'm aware of everything you've done. The financial fraud, the building code violations, the harassment." He paused. "All of it." Boyd went pale. "Those allegations are... The investigation is going to proceed. I'm not here to threaten you, Mr. Wessler. I don't make threats. I'm here to tell you that you're going to cooperate fully with the county investigation. You're going to accept whatever penalties are assessed, and you're going to leave Kearney. Not because I'm telling you to. Because the alternative, when the full scope of your activities comes to light, is going to be significantly less comfortable than relocation." Boyd opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Who are you?" Jaxson stood up. "Someone who sat on a curb in the rain once and watched you humiliate a woman who was worth more than everything you'll ever own." He left Boyd sitting in the diner booth with his coffee going cold and his hands trembling on the table, and he felt nothing. No satisfaction, no catharsis, no sense of justice served. Just the flat, gray absence of a man who has done what needed doing and knows it changes nothing about the thing that actually matters. 3 weeks passed. Christmas came and went. Jaxson spent it in the penthouse, alone, reading a book about maritime law that he didn't care about, while the city sparkled 63 floors below. And then, on a Tuesday evening in early January, Pierce called and said, "There's a woman at the lobby desk asking for you. She says her name is Kylie Ellison." Jaxson didn't breathe for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Send her up." She came out of the elevator looking exactly like herself. Blue cardigan, pilling at the elbows, sneakers, dark hair pushed behind her ears, and she looked around the penthouse with an expression that was not impressed or intimidated, but rather deeply, carefully analytical, as though she were translating what she saw into a language she understood. "So this is what $400 million looks like," she said. "Some of it. It's very, she searched for the word, echoey." He almost smiled. "It is." She didn't sit down. She stood in the middle of his living room with her arms crossed and her chin up, and she said, "I know it was you. The building, the trust. Reed Bridge. Kylie, don't deny it." "I wasn't going to." "Good." She took a breath. "I came here to say 2 things. The first thing is, what you did for those kids, for that program, was the most significant thing anyone has ever done for me, and I'm grateful. I need you to know that. You said 2 things. The second thing is that I'm still furious with you." Her voice cracked on the word furious, and the crack revealed something underneath. Not anger, or not only anger, but the particular anguish of someone who wanted desperately to forgive and couldn't figure out how without betraying herself. "You lied to me, Jaxson. You created a test and I was a subject, and the fact that you decided I passed doesn't make it less dehumanizing. It makes it more, because you had all the power the entire time and I had none, and I didn't even know the game was being played." "You're right," he said. She blinked. "What?" "You're right. Every word of that is right. What I did was selfish and arrogant and controlling, and the fact that I did it because I was hurt doesn't excuse it. I told myself I was looking for something real, but what I was actually doing was rigging the test so I couldn't get hurt. Then I set the terms. I held the secret. I watched and I evaluated, and I told myself I was being brave when I was being the opposite." She stared at him. He kept going. "You want to know what I learned? I didn't learn that you were real. I already knew that. I knew it the first time you told me people don't usually stay, and I knew it when you sat on the floor of that community center packing books while your heart was breaking, and I knew it every time you looked at me and saw a person instead of a paycheck. What I learned is that I'm the one who wasn't real. I was hiding. From you, from myself, from the possibility that someone could see me clearly and still choose to leave. And that's exactly what you did. You saw me clearly, all of it, the lie, the test, the selfishness. And you chose to leave. And that was the most honest thing anyone has ever done to me. The room was very quiet. Below them, Manhattan hummed and glittered, oblivious. So, he said, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just telling you the truth, because I owe you that, and because it's all I have that's actually mine. Kylie uncrossed her arms. She looked at the floor. She looked at the window. She looked at him. The coffee you brought me, she said. The gas station coffee. Was that part of the test? No. The night you waited with me for the tow truck, in the rain, was that part of the test? No. The way you looked at Boyd Wessler when he came into the Reed Bridge celebration, like you were going to take him apart with your bare hands, was that? That was the realest thing I've felt in 10 years. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. I can't just... She stopped, started again. I can't just fall into this. Into you. Into this. She gestured at the penthouse, at the marble and the glass, at the empire that lived behind it. Because this isn't my world, Jaxson. My world is community centers and bus stops and gas station coffee. And if I step into this, I need to know that I'm stepping in as me. Not as the woman who passed the test. Not as a symbol, or a story, or a proof of concept. As me, Kylie. Overweight, underfunded, stubborn, real. That's exactly who I want. Prove it. How? I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. And it won't be easy, and it won't be fast, and it won't look like whatever you're used to. I'm used to people lying to me for money. The bar is low. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. And that almost was enough to make Jaxson Hargrove, a man who had faced down federal agents and rival kingpins and the cold barrel of a gun pointed at his chest, feel something very close to hope. Come by the community center sometime, she said. The real you. Bring coffee. The good kind this time. You can afford it. When? Whenever you're ready to sit on a curb and be a person. She left. The elevator doors closed. The penthouse was quiet. He was there the next morning, not in a suit, not in the Goodwill flannel either. He wore jeans that fit and a jacket that wasn't broken and boots that didn't have cracked soles. And he carried 2 cups of coffee from a place on Newark Avenue that roasted their own beans. And he sat on the steps of the community center at 7 a.m. and waited. She came out the door at 7:15 with her keys in one hand and a stack of papers in the other, and she saw him, and she stopped. You're early, she said. I've been waiting a long time. She sat down next to him. She took the coffee. She sipped it and raised her eyebrows. This is significantly better than gas station coffee. Everything's going to be significantly better from here. That remains to be seen, but she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time since he'd told her the truth, a small, cautious, hard-won smile that didn't promise anything, but didn't close any doors either. It was the smile of a woman who had decided to take the risk of being seen by someone who had already proven he could hurt her and who was choosing, against all sensible advice, to believe that he wouldn't. He earned it, not all at once, and not easily. He came to the community center 3 times a week. He read to the kids. He painted murals. He fixed the sound system permanently, which turned out to require replacing it entirely. He learned Aaliyah's name, and Deshawn's name, and the names of all 23 kids, and he sat on the floor with them during reading time and listened to them struggle through sentences with the patient attention of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to show up for something that didn't pay. He introduced Kylie to his world incrementally, not the violent parts. Those he kept sealed away, walled off, and began the slow, painful process of dismantling. He brought her to dinner with Thatcher, who was charming and nervous, and who later told Jaxson, "She's terrifying and wonderful, and you should marry her immediately." He took her to the legitimate businesses, the real estate holdings, the restaurant group, the charitable foundation that his accountants had created for tax purposes, but that Kylie, within a month, had restructured into something that actually functioned as a force for good. He also went to therapy. Kylie had suggested it. Suggested is a generous word. She'd said, "You need to talk to someone who isn't me about the fact that you created a fake identity to test women's love, because that is several layers of attachment dysfunction that I am not qualified to address." He'd gone reluctantly to a therapist in Montclair who specialized in what she called high-control individuals, and the therapist had spent the first 3 sessions just getting him to admit that his childhood had been abnormal. It was slow. The kind of slow that tests your patience and rewards your persistence. The slow of 2 people building something real on ground that had been salted by deception, watering it daily with honesty and stubbornness, and the kind of small, daily kindnesses that don't make stories but do make lives. He never asked her to change. Not her body. Not her wardrobe. Not her pilling cardigans or her sneakers, or the way she drove her newly repaired Toyota, even though he offered to buy her anything she wanted. She turned down the car. She turned down the clothes. She accepted the funding for Reed Bridge because it wasn't for her. It was for the kids. Everything else, she said, she would earn. She changed his life in ways he hadn't known were possible. She made him laugh. She made him eat dinner at a table instead of at a desk. She made him call his brother on his birthday. She made him sit still long enough to realize that the restlessness he'd carried his entire life wasn't ambition. It was fear. Fear of being seen. Fear of being known. Fear that if anyone looked past the money and the power and the name, they'd find nothing worth loving underneath. Kylie had looked, and she'd found something. Not a perfect man. Not a redeemed one. Not fully, not yet. A man who was trying. A man who had lied and who was learning, painfully and imperfectly, how to tell the truth. A man who sat on the floor of a community center and read books about dolphins to a 7-year-old, and who went home to a penthouse where the woman he loved was sitting on the couch in a pilling cardigan, eating takeout and reading grant applications, and who understood, looking at her, that this was the only wealth that had ever meant anything. On a spring evening, 4 months after she'd walked into his penthouse and told him to prove it, they were sitting on the steps of the community center. The sun was going down. The air smelled like cut grass and warming pavement, and the particular sweetness of a city in April when everything is beginning. Jax, she said. She still called him that sometimes. It was the name she'd fallen in love with, and she wasn't ready to let it go entirely, and he didn't ask her to. Yeah. Thank you. For what? For sitting on that curb in the rain, when you didn't have to. He looked at her. The blue cardigan, the brown eyes that weren't amber or mahogany, or any of the words that men invented to make some browns more valuable than others. The face that the world had decided wasn't worth seeing, and that he would spend the rest of his life looking at. Kylie, he said. That was the only thing I've ever had to do. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The streetlights came on one by one, and the community center glowed behind them, and inside it, on shelves that he had helped build, and she had filled with stories. 23 children's worth of books waited for morning. This is what love looks like when you strip everything else away. Not grand gestures. Not private jets. Not the gleaming machinery of power deployed in someone's name. A curb. A cup of coffee. A choice to stay. And the willingness, after everything, to be seen as you are, imperfect, uncertain, and completely, irreversibly human, by someone who has decided, against all evidence and expectation, that what you are is enough.